and eventually going to Mars will mean for the science and technology of tomorrow.
Yeah, if you'll permit me an analogy. So I was here, by the way, and watched Apollo 11 astronauts walk on the moon. So I remember that, and I remember the inspiration that was to me and to those from my generation. The analogy that I'll use for you is, right, a car today and a car from the early 1900s look pretty similar in some regards. They have a steering wheel, they have wheels, they transport people, any number of people depending on the design. But when you look inside the engine, they're very different. They're very different machines. The technology that we're going to the moon with this time is very different. And the technologies that we're developing are actually developing entire industries to support those technologies. Industries, craft trades, things of that nature that are helping the economic engine of the United States as well as our partnering countries.
I lived in East Texas, and I remember everything about that Saturday morning when Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated. I still feel it to this day. Next week, we will recognize NASA's Day of Remembrance to honor the heroes that made that ultimate sacrifice to advance our nation's space flight and exploration programs. I know my time is waning. How do we plan to communicate the upcoming risk as we continue to go farther? Would anyone like to answer that?
I would like to at least start out by doing that. So many of us lived through the tragedy of Columbia, and many of us witnessed the tragedy of Challenger as well. And those of us who are still within the agency take those lessons very seriously. And we make sure that when we have a day of remembrance, we remember not only the tremendous lives that these people lived and the sacrifices that they made, but we remember why we do what we do and why we are so focused on risk and on safety, which is the reason, for example, we did not hesitate to adjust the launch date for Artemis II when it became evident that safety was of utmost importance with the challenges we were facing.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Chinese Communist Party threatens almost every component of our government and the lives of Americans, obviously. Ms. Kerner, your written testimony didn't mention China at all. Mr. Russell, you mentioned diversity, but you didn't mention China. Ms. Scott didn't mention China. Dr. Griffin, your testimony does mention our adversary, China, and I wonder if you would expound upon why you went to such detail for the clarification of others.
In my judgment, China, and I don't want to say China, I want to say the Chinese Communist Party, fully understands and frequently says that their goal is to be the world's great power. They regard the Western democracies as decadent and outmoded and ineffective and inefficient. China's president, he has other titles, Xi, bullies neighboring countries, presumes to take control of international waterways, supervises a military establishment that has recently sunk other people's ships fishing in their own waters. Everything about the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party suggests that they are their adversary, and they say so. To allow a situation to develop where the human frontier is populated by our adversary and we are not there should be unacceptable to this nation and to our Western and Asian partners. It should be unacceptable. We are not on a path to recognize that. The rest of the world looks and will always look to the nations that occupy the frontier and exploit the frontier and extend the frontier as leaders of the world. I believe that's a position that the United States should occupy in preference to our adversaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Griffin. And you mentioned frontier. Add to that ultimate military high ground. whoever controls space will control the destiny of this Earth.
As you know, I've spent considerable time in the national security side of our space programs as well, and I really consider them to be one program. But I came here today to discuss civil space, sir, and we can discuss military space at another occasion.
How should America make it our goal to ensure that we emerge as first among equals when it comes to setting standards? We've had a couple hearings on that.
Well, the standards are set by the people who show up. They're not set by the people who watch what happens with others. So by returning to the moon in a focused and expeditious manner, which we are not today, we will inevitably bring along, we will be required to bring along communications and navigation and other infrastructure systems, which we expect others will use as well. By that mechanism, we will have established the standards, just as we did with the ICAO starting at the end of World War II for global air transport. But again, those are facts on the ground that are created by the people who are on the frontier first. They're not created by the people who follow.
Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Kerner, what specific steps are being taken to address what some consider to be the outdated gas and propellant pipelines and other ground systems at Kennedy Space Center to ensure that we have the capacity to support our booming commercial space sector?
So the infrastructure at the Kennedy Space Center, as well as at all of our centers, is very much aging, and we are aware of that within the agency. I will tell you from an Artemis perspective, we are investing heavily in the capabilities that we need to support the Artemis missions. Last year, we had over 70 launches from this Florida Space Coast. It's an exciting time for all of us in the space industry. Most of those were on the Cape side, but we also had a number of them from our side at the Kennedy Space Center. And in order, in order to support those, we have poured heavily, as I said, into the infrastructure. But we also recognize that there's still more that is needed there. Many of the launches from that area are commercial in nature, and we have use agreements with our commercial and industry partners that allow them to actually invest in the infrastructure as well. We know as an agency that our infrastructure is older than I am in some cases, and our NASA leadership has established what's called NASA 2040, which is an internal effort to look at all of the agency's infrastructure and mission support functions to be able to set us up properly for what the agency's mission is going to be in the 2040 timeframe. Infrastructure like that at the Kennedy Space Center, which is critically important to us in Artemis, is part of that discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I yield back with a request that we also have a weather modification technology hearing again. Thank you.
Duly noted. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, as I understand it, our effort to go to the moon is going to rely on at least 5 major, distinct, multi-billion-dollar development programs that have to sync up perfectly. The SLS rocket, the Orion crew vehicle, the exploration ground system, the human landing system, as well as the spacesuit. They're all going to be procured under different acquisition mechanisms. I particularly would like to know about the cryogenic fluid management and other new technologies. What happens if these 5 major programs don't sync up, or if one gets slowed down? How do we proceed? Can you address that, Mr. Kerner, Ms. Kerner?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. So we established the Moon to Mars Program Office just last year, pursuant to the NASA Authorization Act, to do just what you're talking about, to integrate all of those programs that are essential for Artemis and ensure that we are properly level loading the risk between those programs so that they all converge together for a mission. We know that it's going to be challenging and difficult for us to, especially as we get into later missions, to get all of those missions to align to the same time frame. And so we have put our contracts in place to continue to develop hardware for the subsequent missions so that we can be ready to execute a mission as soon as all of the elements are available. We also recognize that there might be some development and technology challenges that come along the way. And so we have a very flexible and adaptable mission structure that allows us to be able to make updates to our mission profiles if we need to, in the event that one element in the Artemis program's cadre does not make it in time for the original planned mission.
Well, just following up, if one of these elements is delayed, what happens to the whole program?
So we would, depending on how long the delay is, depending on the reason for the delay, we would potentially execute a slightly modified version of that mission. And I mention that only because we have set in place for our agency a process that allows us to keep our eye on the exploration objectives, and all of our missions contribute to those exploration objectives. So we can modify the mission content to adjust to still accomplish those objectives. Unlike, for example, when we flew space shuttle missions, each mission was very independent and different. With Artemis, we're building a capability, not just a launch capability, but a capability in cislunar orbit, capability on the surface of the moon over time. And as any large-scale development activity knows, when you do that, you can make adjustments for when something gets delivered late or something shows up differently. You focus then on another aspect or another objective that you're trying to achieve.
Let me ask this. The IG issued a report in October of last year about the supply chain monitoring. What has NASA done to adopt those recommendations relative to the Artemis supply chain?
So we certainly do appreciate our governing organizations that provide us feedback and contribute to the benefit of the program. We have looked at our supply chain and supply chain management and looked at how we can better manage that. And I'll speak again to what I mentioned previously. The Moon to Mars Program Office, that office was deliberately established so that we can connect all of what were previously disparate programs and look across the board and address some of these supply chain issues.
I want to say I also saw the landing on the moon. It was a stunning thing, but I'll confess at the time I thought, how is this helping us here on Earth? Now, I listened closely to Dr. Griffin's assessment of the Chinese. I completely agree with him. I do think it's important to outline for the American public why this matters to them. And I'm wondering, Ms. Kerner, if you can outline efforts that NASA is making to explain why this matters to America. And by the way, I concur in the chairman's comment that the administrator has huge confidence in you. So if you could answer that.
Thank you. That's a little bit embarrassing, I'll admit. But I'll say one of the efforts that we have done within our agency within the last couple of years really focus on the why of exploration. And we identified 3 pillars associated with that why: science, national posture, and inspiration. Science, I think, is obvious. It's the engine that generates economic benefit wherever it goes, and in addition to inspiring the next generation of STEM, as well as teachers and those of us who look to the scientific discovery with wonder and decide that is something I want to learn more about and want to pursue. Additionally, national posture, I think we've spoken to that a little bit already with Dr. Griffin's testimony, but I'll state we believe, and our administrators spoke about it just last week, that we will be on the surface of the moon before China is. And it's our intent for that to happen. Now, there are other government agencies that can provide a much more detailed briefing that we can do in a different environment than here that can give you more insight and information about China's progress and about our progress along those lines. Let's see, I mentioned the 2 of the 3 pillars. The third one, inspiration. Again, it's what inspired me to pursue a STEM career. It's what inspired many people in my generation and really developed that next generation that we're starting to see. And we hope to do that inspiration, not just here in the United States, but around the world.
Well, I thank you very much. Just by the way, before I yield back, we had an astronaut come and meet with students in Hollister, California, just a few days ago, inspiring those young people. It's very important. I thank you, Ms. Chairman, and yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and before I turn to my next colleague for questions, I would note, since it's true confession time, yes, I was 9 years old that summer, too. But in my part of rural Oklahoma, we had one television station, we only had AM radio, and this strange concept called party lines for a phone system.
I remember those.
You know exactly how many relatives you have based on what you said on the phone. That said, I turn to the gentleman, Mr. McCormick, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Artemis mission is not only about returning the humans to the moon, but about advancing technology, fostering international cooperation, stimulating the economy, inspiring the public, and securing the United States' position as leaders in space exploration. Similarly, in the 1960s, we were again faced with the space race, only this time with the Chinese, not just the Russians. The United States must be a leader in space, and we must lead by setting the standards we know will continue the incredible innovation and advancement we have fostered here. I have a keen understanding of the important implications of the Artemis program for our economy, national security, and advancement of technology, but do think we need to evaluate the real challenges of NASA we're facing to achieve their goal in a timely and cost-effective manner. I'm going to take a little tack away from our typical questioning, get into a little bit of medicine and human physiology in space as a physician. Recently, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs and Walter Reed Army Institute of Research have come together to look at a promising technology known as mitochondrial organelle transplantation to address the mitochondria dysfunction and neurodegenerative diseases that we've seen in human beings, but also in astronauts for some reason we don't even know why. Is NASA aware of the work that the VA, and this is an obscure question, so I understand I'm probably talking outside the normal purview, but is NASA aware of this study between the VA and Walter Reed addressing mitochondrial dysfunction, and would they be willing to work towards advancing technology to help these astronauts protect their energy cells, if you will?
So you may or may not know this about me, but one of the interesting career parts of my career path is that I spent 5 years running the Human Health and Performance Directorate at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. As an engineer running a health and medical organization, I found it very fascinating, and I learned a lot of things about human physiology and how very little we actually understand about how the human system responds in a microgravity environment. And we today do not understand how the human system would respond in microgravity, followed by partial gravity, back to microgravity. The longest duration crew member that we have just recently returned last year, and he only spent 371 days in space. When we go to Mars, we're going to have to spend close to 1,000 days in space. So I recognize that, that the human as a system is something that we need to investigate and explore further. I also know that we have done a number of studies and a number of investigations with the team that we have at the Johnson Space Center on the exact problem that you indicated. I'm not even going to try to spell it or say it as you so eloquently did, because I am not a physician. But I will say that we have made great strides in understanding not only what happens to the astronauts, but what happens to the astronauts and how that can then apply to similar, I'll say, subjects on the ground. And that transferring of that technology and that information has made great strides in a number of medical fields. You can find equipment that we use for treating astronauts in an emergency room anywhere in the United States and around the world. So we do actually partner with them and with others, and I would welcome further conversation on that and putting you in touch with some of the folks that we have that do that work on a regular basis.
I think that's amazing. As a matter of fact, if you want to consider somebody who's a pilot and a physician and maybe a congressman going on one of those missions, just let me know.
I'll keep that in mind. Thank you.
Dr. Griffin, it's no secret that China has a goal to surpass the United States by 2045. As global leaders in space, we can't allow this to happen. I think the leading edge that we have in space technology will protect the United States in not just the economy, but technologies that can benefit humankind, like we just discussed. As the United States works to recruit additional international partners, how can we, the government, continue to promote its vision in space diplomacy over China's? In other words, you can see countries like India putting a vehicle on the dark side of the moon for about $75 million. Now, granted, it's not manned, so it does cut some corners, and they maybe don't have the same bureaucracy requirements, but how can we partner with other countries to make this a more efficient process?
the way we effectively partner with other countries is to establish that we are going to do great things and that there is room for everybody of like mind to join us. We can't partner with people. We can't partner with people with an empty bag. Okay, we have to be clearly seen to be doing things in an efficient, expeditious, focused, determined way. And when that happens, partners will appear.
Great, thanks. And I'll just yield with the statement that this investment is an investment in the future and has great economic and technological benefit to us as we continue to invest in Artemis. Thank you. I yield.
Our gentleman yields back, recognize my colleague, Ms. Carveo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lucas and Ranking Member Sorensen, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. If there's one state that perhaps unexpectedly is synonymous with the Artemis missions, it's my home state of Colorado. Excuse me. From navigation tools associated with the mission to the Orion capsule itself, Colorado's advanced aerospace infrastructure has been pivotal in the development of these missions. I'm also proud to say that I represent many of the workers and contractors who have made Artemis possible, and I'm excited to continue my support for these missions. However, I think we have heard a lot of concerns here about the timeline for the Artemis missions, and I think something that we've kind of been beating around the bush about is overall funding for NASA and whether you have the money to carry these missions out. Associate Administrator Kerner, in particular, when we hear today about the pressures that you have to cut costs to maintain crew safety, to keep things on time, but also when we have a Congress that has been unable to pass a budget overall, what are the implications for Artemis if NASA is appropriated with flat budgets beyond not just 2024, but potentially the rest of the decade?
So as I mentioned earlier, we are in production on not only Artemis 2, but Artemis 3, Artemis 4, Artemis 5. We have hardware and builds for all of those missions at various stages, right? So consistency in budget helps us be able to keep the cadence of those missions to where we can keep our team fresh and keep our team active and have them be able to actually produce the hardware in a timely fashion. We have been challenged by Congress to have an annual cadence of our missions, and if we get stuck in either a flat line or a reduced budget kind of environment, what that means is we will prioritize the near-term missions. Artemis 2 and Artemis 3 will be prioritized, and those other missions in the interval between those other missions will continue to push out to the right. It would be my hope that we wouldn't be faced with that kind of a situation, but that's how I would envision that playing out. I would add, though, resources is more than just budget in my mind. Time is also a resource, but also personnel is a resource. And one of the benefits of flying these Artemis missions is we inspire the next generation of engineers, of technicians, of welders, of people that can actually do the work, which there's a tremendous shortage of skilled labor in some areas. That is, I'm sure you know if you've talked to your for example, some of the contractors that are in your home state, they'll tell you it's sometimes challenging to find the right skill level for building and doing the things that we're trying to do with Artemis. So consistency both in budget, but also the resources and the inspiration that we can provide to inspire that next individual who can help us build the generation that we're looking forward to building.
Thank you so much. Those are very good points, and I think the consistency in budget probably has a direct implication on people being willing to take these jobs. So, Dr. Griffin, in that same kind of vein, in your experience, what can the impact of flat budgets and budgetary uncertainty for short-term CRs and shutdown threats, which we've had many of this session, have on the NASA contractor workforce and its ability to meet NASA's needs?
Sorry. In my experience in both DoD and NASA, multiple occasions over the years, it's not so much a flat budget that is a problem. Actually, most of the time I would welcome a flat budget if I knew I was going to have it. It needs to be at an appropriate level to accomplish the task at hand, but flatness in itself is not the issue. The issue is that when we do not have an appropriation on time year after year, we force the government actually does very little work itself. It may plan and may integrate work, but the work is done by American industry and in some cases our partner industries. And when we stop and start that funding by delaying or even skipping our appropriation cycles as we did in 2008, that is a huge problem.
Thank you very much. I yield back the remainder of my time.